Hey everybody, it's Ketch from Old Crow Medicine Show. I'm excited to do a little reading for you on this beautiful spring morning, mid-morning, early afternoon. Anyhow, all the dogwoods are in bloom. God, they look gorgeous. Let me just show you. Oh, wait till you see this. Rhapsody in white. Glorious, right? Hey, I'm about to read from one of my favorite books. It's by Wiley. It's called A Land More Kind Than Home.
I followed Joe Bill farther down the river than we'd ever gone before. We stopped at the bridge and came up a new path from the riverbank through the bright sunlight and crossed the road toward the woods on the other side. We walked along the railroad tracks where you could smell the dusty ties getting baked dry in the heat, and then we went into the trees and crawled through briars and over rotten limbs and didn't say a word to each other until we stood in the shade on the edge of the woods and stared across the field at the back of the church. It was so hot that my hair and my shirt were soaked through with sweat, and I figured that if I told somebody I'd just been baptized in the river with all my clothes on, then they would have believed it. I could feel that sweat running down my legs beneath my blue jeans, and I knew it would start itching me when it dried. I untucked my shirt and wiped my face, and then I tucked it back inside my jeans because Mama had told us over and over that we'd better keep our shirts tucked in while we were at church. She always said Joe Bill's mama didn't care one bit about what he looked like at church, and I reckon she was right because he'd untucked his shirt and unbuttoned some of the buttons too. He reached up and grabbed a tree limb and pulled it down and held on to it. I looked around for a limb that I could pull down and hold on to too, but there wasn't any that I could reach. Joe Bill was 11 and I was just 9, and that meant he wasn't just 2 years older than me. He was 2 years taller too. I watched a hot breeze come across the field and move through the high grass on its way to us. I looked over at Joe Bill as the breeze pushed his cowlick off his forehead. His hair was blond, but in the shade it looked almost as brown as mine because it was wet from him sweating so much. He looked over at me and then he looked back toward the field. "It's right there," he said, nodding toward the church. I looked across the field, but I didn't know what I was supposed to be looking at because I hadn't ever seen the back of the church before. Up front it had big windows that somebody had covered over from the inside with newspapers so long ago that they'd been turned yellow from the sun. There was only one window around the back of the church, and it had a rusted old air conditioner sitting up inside it. "Right there," Joe Bill said. He raised his hand and pointed his finger out across the field to where the air conditioner hung out of the window. There were some rotten-looking boards blocking in the sides of it, but it almost looked like it might be too heavy for them boards to hold it up in there. "You see it?" Joe Bill asked. I see it," I told him. He looked over at me again, and then he took a step closer like somebody might have been watching us, and he was afraid they'd hear what he was about to tell me next. "There's gaps in between them boards in the window frame," he said. "If you get up close enough, you can see right in there." I looked at that air conditioner, and even though I couldn't hear it from where we were standing, I could see it blowing hot air down into the grass right under the window. The church was painted white, but around the bottom it had been turned orange from where dirt and mud had been splashed up from the grass during rainstorms. "I bet he's still in there," Joe Bill said. "You think?" "I bet he is," he said. "It ain't been long since Mr. Thompson came down and got him." Joe Bill let go of the limb he'd been holding, and it whipped right past my ear and snapped back up into the tree. "Hey!" I hollered out. "You just about took my dang ear off." "Shh!" he whispered. "Be quiet." He closed his eyes and dropped his head, and for a minute it looked like he was fixing to pray, but then he opened his eyes real slow, like he just woke up from a nap. "Listen," he said. "To what?" "You can't hear that?" "Hear what?" "Listen again," he said again. I dropped my head and I closed my eyes just like I'd seen Joe Bill do, and for a minute I couldn't hear nothing at all except for a few birds fussing in the trees above us and the sound of the breeze coming through the dry grass, and after a minute I couldn't even hear that. But then, real slow, the singing of the crickets raised up out of the woods behind me, and their chirping sounded like somebody was scratching a spoon across a clean dinner plate, and past that, across the railroad tracks on the other side of the woods, I could hear the river running slow toward Marshall, and it was so soft that I wondered if I was making it up or remembering the sound of it just because it was supposed to be there. Then I couldn't hear nothing until I turned my ears to listen for what was in front of me out there in the field where the grasshoppers and the katydids hummed in the high grass. This was a noise I'd always heard without even knowing I could hear it, and when I heard this I could finally hear what Joe Bill was talking about. At first I heard it like a heartbeat, and I felt it in my chest like a heartbeat too, like it was inside my body thumping up against my ribs because it wanted to get out. It made me think about the Madison High Marching Band at the football games and the marchers with the drums strapped to their chests and the feeling you get inside you when they march out onto the field at halftime with the batons and the horns and the drums and all that noise they make. And now I could hear other noises floating just above the sound of that heartbeat. The electric guitar came out over the field like a crackly old radio that wasn't tuned in good, and the sound of somebody banging away on the piano followed behind it. All of a sudden, I knew that what I was hearing was music, and when I opened my eyes, I knew it was coming from inside the church. I looked over at Joe Bill. "It's music," I said.